My name is Raymond Walker, 58 years old, born on a windy March morning in a small Indiana town most people only pass through on their way to somewhere better. My whole life has been built from sweat, sawdust, and calloused hands. I've never been the flashy type. Never cared for shiny things, loud crowds, or the kind of people who talk more than they listen. Folks around here say I'm the quiet kind of dependable steady, like an old fence post that's been standing in the same field for decades, holding up whatever weight life decides to throw at it. But the truth is, life doesn't give a damn how steady you are. It can hit you from the side when you least expect it, knock the wind clean out of you, and leave you wondering how long you've been living blind to what was coming. The hardest hit didn't come from an accident, or a job gone wrong, or even age catching up with me. It came from my own daughter, my Emily, the same little girl who once clung to my leg at the county fair because she thought she'd get lost in the crowd. The same girl whose laughter used to ring through the house like church bells on Sunday morning. The girl who used to call me her hero, even though I was just a man trying to keep food on the table and a roof over her head. That girl, that woman now, stood across from me one quiet afternoon and looked at me like she didn't know who I was. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, her voice didn't even shake. She just said, "Dad, sometimes you feel like a stranger to me." A stranger. The words slid between us like a blade that didn't need sharpening. I remember standing there feeling the air get thick around me like I was suddenly underwater and every breath burned. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter. It wasn't the sort of pain that kicks up heat inside your chest. No, it was cold, heavy. A kind of cold that doesn't come from the weather, one that starts somewhere deep in the bones where memories live. For a moment, everything around me went blurry, like the world tilted and I slid right off it. And all I could do was stare at her and wonder how we had wandered so far from each other without ever noticing the distance growing. She stood straight, her shoulders pulled back, her face calm and polite, for God's sake. Like I wasn't the man who spent nights rocking her to sleep when she had nightmares, or the one who sat through every school recital even when I was dead on my feet from working overtime. I looked at her, and I swear I saw a stranger too. Not because she wasn't my child anymore, but because she had become someone the world shaped without me by her side. Someone who was taught, somewhere along the way, that the man who raised her didn't fit in her new life. That night I went home and sat at my old wooden desk. It's scratched up now, covered in years of nicks and grooves from tools, coffee mugs, and age. Funny thing is, some of those scratches came from her tiny hands when she used to sit beside me with her coloring books while I worked on carpentry plans. I used to pretend I didn't mind the crayon marks and pen dents she left behind, even though back then the desk was brand new. Now, those scratches are the only things on that desk I'd never sand away. I sat there for a long while staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of me. I'm not a writer, I never have been. My hands are better suited for hammers and sanders than pens. But that night, something in me needed to speak, needed to spill out the truth I'd been holding inside for years, maybe decades. So I wrote. Slowly at first, then faster, like the words had been waiting behind a dam that finally cracked open. I wrote about the nights I stayed up worrying about her future. I wrote about the sacrifices she never saw. I wrote about the love that never stopped, even when the calls did. I wrote everything I had never said out loud. Line after line, page after page, until the truth was laid bare in front of me. And when I finished writing, when the ink finally dried and my hand felt cramped and stiff, I did something no father ever imagined he's doing until he's pushed to the edge of heartbreak and clarity. I folded my will, the document that held everything I had worked for, everything I hoped to leave behind, and I tucked it inside the envelope with the letter. I didn't put it in there because I have one foot in the grave. I'm not dying, not yet anyway, not unless something unexpected decides to show up at my door. I put it inside because she needed to see with her own eyes what she was walking away from. Not the money, not the property, none of that matters. She needed to understand what she meant to me, how she is woven into everything I've built and everything I'll leave behind. She needed to know what she was about to lose, not in the future but right now, in that moment when she called me a stranger. The next morning I woke before the sun came up. The air outside was crisp, the kind that bites at your cheeks and wakes the rest of you up slow. I slipped the thick white envelope into my jacket and drove to the small post office on the edge of town. I stood in line behind a couple mailing holiday cards, and for a split second I wondered if I was making a mistake. But the thought passed quickly. Some truths can't wait for the perfect time. When I slid the envelope into the outgoing mail slot, I felt something shift inside me, like a weight dropping, or maybe a piece of myself settling back into place. That simple act, letting go of that envelope, felt heavier than any beam of wood I had ever lifted. I went home, made myself a black coffee, and tried to pretend it was just another day. It was. Because later that afternoon, just as I was cleaning up my tools from the porch, my phone buzzed. I wiped my hands on my jeans, pulled the phone out of my pocket, and there it was, a message from Emily. A single line that hit harder than any punch I'd taken in my life. "Why would you send this to me?" No greeting. No explanation. Just that question. A question that carried confusion, maybe anger, maybe fear. A question that meant she had opened the envelope. A question that meant the truth I had sealed inside was now alive between us. But before you understand the weight of that message, the tone behind it, the storm hiding inside those 7 words, you need to know what came before it. Because a letter only matters when you know the story that shaped the hand that wrote it. And mine didn't start with goodbye. It started years ago, long before she ever called me a stranger. Emily wasn't always distant. In fact, when she was small, she clung to me like the sun clings to the sky at dawn. From the moment she came into this world, red-faced and screaming like she already had opinions about life, I felt something inside me shift, like my heart suddenly had arms of its own, reaching toward her. She was my first child, my only child, and from the very beginning I understood that whatever path my life took, every turn would somehow lead back to her. Some of my favorite memories are the simple ones, the ones that don't look special to anyone else on the outside. Saturday mornings, she'd wake me up before the alarm ever thought about ringing. She'd climb on my back, whisper, "Daddy, pancakes," like the word itself was a password to another world. And even when my body was sore from working construction all week, I'd get up and carry her into the kitchen. I'd lift her onto the counter, and she'd swing her legs while she stirred the batter with more enthusiasm than skill. Sometimes we'd ruin the first batch because she dumped in too much vanilla or forgot the eggs, but she'd laugh so hard I couldn't help but join in. Those mornings were loud and messy and perfect. On warm weekends, we'd drive out to Miller's Creek, this quiet little spot about 15 minutes from town. I had a beat-up old Ford that squeaked every time you turned the wheel, and the AC barely worked, so we'd roll the windows down and let the wind fill the truck like we were driving through our own private world. Emily would sing whatever song she'd heard that week, usually off-key, usually too loud, usually with words she made up halfway through. But it was her voice, her joy, echoing through that truck, and I swear those were some of the best concerts I ever attended. At the creek, she'd sit on my lap while I cast the line for her. We barely caught anything worth keeping, but she didn't care. For her, fishing wasn't about fish, it was about stories. She'd talk nonstop about school friends, what she wanted to be when she grew up. It changed weekly. One day she wanted to be a vet, the next a dancer, the next a scientist who solved the world's sadness. Kids say things like that without knowing how heavy the world is, and maybe that's what makes their words so powerful. They believe in things adults forget to hope for. Back then she was my shadow. She followed me everywhere. She trusted me with everything, and I thought that bond was unbreakable. But life has a way of shifting the ground right under your feet, so quietly you don't notice until you're already falling. Things started to change when she hit 13. Not dramatically, not all at once, just little cracks that grew slowly. Her mother, Laura, and I began drifting apart long before we actually said the words out loud. We weren't fighters. We weren't the couple who screamed at each other behind closed doors. We simply became two people moving in different directions, like roads that started together but forked off without any announcement. We tried counseling, tried late-night talks, tried pretending, but nothing held us in place. Eventually, we decided it was better to part ways calmly than force something that had quietly died years earlier. What I didn't expect, what I never saw coming, was how much power Laura's voice would carry in the space between us. She wasn't loud. She wasn't cruel. She spoke in soft tones, almost gentle, but there was a sharpness hidden underneath, like velvet wrapped around a blade. Little comments slipped into conversations with Emily, tiny seeds of doubt planted carefully, subtly. "You don't need him for everything, sweetie. You're growing up now. You don't need to depend on your dad so much. He's old-fashioned. He won't understand your world. He means well, but he lives in the past." Nothing outright mean. Nothing you could grab onto and say, "Hey, that's not fair." Just slow poison. A drip, not a flood. The kind you don't notice until you're already dizzy from it. I tried my best, I really did. I never missed a visitation, not one. Even if it was snowing, even if my truck was acting up, even if my back felt like someone was hammering nails between the vertebrae from lifting beams all week. I showed up with snacks, with jokes, with plans for the day. I paid for her school trips, her braces, her soccer gear, even when I had to take extra jobs to cover it. I didn't do it to be a hero. I did it because that's what a father does. You show up. You keep showing up, even when the world tries to edge you out. But kids change when they grow. They start seeing the world through different windows. And when someone is whispering through those windows, reshaping the view, you don't notice until the scenery's different. By the time she hit 17, I felt her slipping. It wasn't dramatic at first, just shorter phone calls, fewer updates about her life, a little more space between her sentences. She stopped calling me dad sometimes and switched to hey, like she was greeting a neighbor rather than the man who raised her. Holidays became negotiable, like they were optional events instead of sacred moments. She always had a reason: study groups, friend plans, bad weather, work shifts. And maybe some of them were true. But excuses pile up the same way sawdust does, one small layer at a time, until suddenly the whole floor is covered. Then she went off to college, and that's when the distance turned from cracks to chasms. The weekly calls became every other week. Then once a month. Then, oops, sorry, I forgot to call. Then nothing unless I called first. I'd hear her voice and feel relief, but even that relief was tinged with something brittle, like I was interrupting a life that didn't have room for me anymore. I'd ask about her classes, her friends, her dreams, and she'd give me answers that felt rehearsed, short, polite. The kind of answers you give someone who used to matter but now belongs to another chapter of your life. One day, during her junior year, she said it without meaning harm, just casually, like it was nothing. "I'll try to visit you soon." Try. To visit her own father. The man who had never missed a weekend with her. I didn't push. I didn't guilt-trip her. I didn't show her the hurt that settled in my chest like a stone. I just told myself that love, real love, was strong enough to hold across any distance. I believed that the bond we built with pancakes and fishing trips and late-night talks would outlast anything. But I was wrong. Love isn't a rope that keeps people tied together. It's a place they choose to return to. And somewhere along the way, Emily stopped choosing me. Brandon slid into Emily's life, the way a draft sneaks through a cracked window, not loud, not obvious. But suddenly the room feels colder, and you realize something changed long before you noticed. Emily was 25 when she first mentioned him, her voice light in that way people sound when they're trying to convince you the new thing in their life is good, even if they're not sure yet. All she said was, "Dad, there's someone I want you to meet." And I remember feeling a flicker of hope, because after years of short calls and "I'll try to visit," She actually sounded like she wanted to share something with me. I didn't know then that sharing and inviting weren't the same thing, not anymore. The first time I saw him was outside a little fusion place Emily picked, one of those restaurants where the portions are small and the menus have ingredients I can't pronounce. I pulled up in my old Ford, stepped down, and there he was, leaning against a spotless black electric car like he wanted the whole street to know he'd arrived. He had that tech industry look, expensive haircut that tried too hard to look effortless, a watch that probably cost more than the tools in my entire workshop, and sneakers so white they practically glowed. When he saw me walk up, he pushed off the car, smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, and stuck out his hand. "Ray," he said, not Mr. Walker, not Raymond, just Ray, like he'd already decided who I was without even knowing me. His hand was soft, no calluses, no strength behind the grip. I've shaken hands with teenagers with firmer handshakes, but I let it go because Emily was watching and I didn't want to start things off with friction. She looked happy, or maybe she looked hopeful. Maybe she wanted me to approve of him, the same way she wanted him to approve of her. I didn't see it clearly then, but now I know she was balancing both sides like a tightrope, not realizing someone else was shaking the wire. Inside the restaurant, everything felt off balance. Emily kept glancing toward him before answering questions, like she needed him to nod before she spoke. She used to talk freely with me, like her words tumbled out before she even thought them through. Now everything was filtered, edited, sanitized. When I asked how work was going, she hesitated, looked at him, and then answered. "It's going good," Brandon cut in before she even drew breath. "She's learning structure. It's been a huge help for her." Structure, help, like she was some kind of project he was managing. Emily smiled politely, but there was something small and fragile in that smile. Something that looked like apology, or maybe exhaustion. Dinner went on like that, Brandon talking, Emily shrinking, me trying to read between the lines. Every time I tried to ask her something real, he answered for her. If I complimented her, he corrected the detail. If I brought up a childhood memory, he'd say, "Actually, Emily doesn't see it that way anymore," like her entire life before him needed rewriting. Halfway through the night, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said with this soft, condescending voice, "Emily grew up with no real direction, so I've helped her create structure." No real direction. The words didn't just sting, they lodged somewhere deep, like a splinter under the skin. Emily had direction. She had more heart, more curiosity, more natural light in her than anyone I'd ever met. The girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after long drives. The girl who would help me carry lumber, even when it was twice her size. The girl who cried when she found a stray puppy and begged me to let her keep it. Emily had direction. It was just hers, not something written in a planner or optimized for productivity. But I stayed quiet, because I could see Emily trying so hard to make everything smooth, to keep the peace, to make sure no one felt uncomfortable. And maybe that was the first sign, the way she took responsibility for everyone's emotions except her own. At the end of the night, when we stepped outside, Emily hugged me, but it felt different, shorter, polite, like a formality instead of a feeling. Brandon waited by the car, tapping something on his smartwatch, not even giving us a minute. When she pulled away, she said, "I'll call you this week, Dad." And for a moment, I believed her. But days passed. Weeks. The calls didn't come. And every time I reached out, the replies were shorter, colder, more distant, like someone else was holding the phone and deciding how much of her I was allowed to have. Brandon wasn't loud, he wasn't abusive, he wasn't even cruel. He was something worse. A quiet eraser. Slow strokes at first, then whole lines disappearing. And piece by piece, he began removing me from my own daughter's life. The day everything finally cracked wasn't dramatic at first glance. It didn't come with shouting or slammed doors or some big confrontation. It came in the quiet, in the kind of moment where life shows you exactly where you stand, or where you no longer stand without raising its voice. It started with something simple, something I'd been looking forward to for months. A gift. Not just any gift, but a piece of myself carved into wood. A dining table I made with my own hands, the way my father once taught me and his father taught him. Oak, thick and strong, cut from a tree that had stood longer than my entire life. I picked every board carefully. I spent nights after long workdays sanding the grain until it felt like silk beneath my palms. I carved the edges with patterns I used to sketch when Emily was little, the same kind she used to trace with her tiny fingers while asking what they meant. I imagined her running her hands along them again, older now, grown, but still my girl. I imagined her future kids doing the same one day, a legacy, something that would outlast me. I didn't tell her I was making it, I wanted it to be a surprise. I saved every extra dollar I could to buy the right materials. I worked late in my small workshop behind the house, the smell of sawdust becoming a comfort, something that made me feel close to her even when she wasn't calling, wasn't visiting, wasn't really there at all. But I kept building, because that's what fathers do. They build things, tables, futures, bridges, even when they're not sure anyone will walk across them. When the table was finally finished, I wrapped it in thick moving blankets, securing the corners like I was protecting something fragile even though it was solid as a stone. I loaded it into the back of my truck, the wood catching the morning light like it had something alive inside it. I felt proud, not of the table really, but of the idea that maybe this gesture would remind Emily of who we were. Maybe it would bring us closer again. When I pulled up to their townhouse, I felt something heavy in my chest, but I brushed it off. Nerves, I thought. Hope disguised as fear. I climbed the steps and knocked on the door, already rehearsing what I'd say when she saw it. But when Emily opened the door, her smile didn't spread fully, the way it used to. It flickered, strained, almost like she was bracing herself instead of welcoming me. Her shoulders stiffened and her eyes darted behind me toward the truck. "Dad, you didn't have to do this," she said, and her voice wasn't warm. It was cautious, careful, like my presence came with consequences now. Before I could answer, Brandon appeared behind her, arms folded across his chest, jaw clenched, wearing that polite smug expression he'd mastered so well. He stepped forward slightly, just enough to stand between us without making it obvious. "That, doesn't really match our style," he said, dragging out the words like he was critiquing something in a showroom. "Emily and I are going for a more modern aesthetic." "It's real wood," I said quietly, not defensive, just confused. Because real wood should mean something. Craftsmanship should mean something. Family should mean something. "Yeah, well, our place is more modern," he repeated with a small shrug, as if the matter was settled. I looked at Emily then, waiting, hopping, wanting her to say something, anything that showed she still valued what came from me. But she only crossed her arms, mirroring him without realizing it, her eyes soft but distant. I asked where I could put it, I managed to say, my voice feeling too small in my own throat. Brandon pointed to the garage. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just pointed like I was delivering a piece of junk someone had left on the curb. And Emily said nothing. So I carried it myself, the table I'd poured months of love into a cold garage that smelled like chemicals and stored boxes. I set it down gently, even though no one else seemed to care whether it scraped or cracked. When I straightened up, Emily was already walking back inside. Brandon didn't say thank you, didn't offer a hand, didn't look at the table again. I stood there alone, the air thick with the kind of silence that fills the space where something breaks. And something did break. Not loudly. Quietly, the way a thread snaps when it's been pulled too tight for too long. A father shouldn't feel like an inconvenience. A father shouldn't feel like an intruder. But that wasn't the betrayal. No, the betrayal came later, sneaking up on me when I least expected it. A week after the drop-off, Emily called asking if I could help fix a leak in their kitchen. Not because she needed me, but because it was free. Because hearing a plumber cost more than dialing my number. I didn't mind. I would have fixed 100 leaks for her, 1,000. I would have built 100 tables. Love doesn't keep score. When I arrived, Brandon wasn't home. Emily led me inside, her voice rushed, her eyes tired, her hair pulled back like she hadn't slept. She didn't offer me coffee like she used to. Didn't ask how I'd been. Just pointed toward the kitchen and said, "The leak's under the sink." I walked through the house, passing rooms that looked staged, not lived in. Perfect angles, cold lines, no personality, no warmth, no trace of my daughter's old spirit. It felt like a house she lived in, not a home she belonged to. When I went to the garage to grab my tool bag, the same garage where I left the table, I stopped in the doorway. The table was gone. At first, I thought maybe they'd moved it inside. Maybe they realized they liked it after all. Maybe I was wrong about everything. "Emily," I called, "where's the table?" Her silence stretched too long, long enough for my stomach to sink, long enough to know the answer before she spoke. She looked at the floor when she finally said, "Dad, we sold it." Sold it. Sold the hours of work. Sold the care carved into every corner. Sold the memory of my hands sanding it while thinking about her first day of kindergarten. Sold the symbol of every mile I drove to see her. Sold the last piece of our history I tried to keep alive. She didn't even say they needed the money. She said it like they'd gotten rid of an old rug. My voice cracked without my permission. "Why?" "Dad," she sighed as if I were the difficult one. "You're too old school. You don't understand my life anymore. We're just different. Brandon and I live a certain way. You wouldn't get it." Different. The word felt like a knife. Not because she'd changed, people change, but because she said it like our worlds could no longer touch, like I belonged in the past, like I was something she'd outgrown. I stood there in that empty garage, looking at the outline where the table had been, a faint rectangle in the dust. It was stupid, maybe, to fixate on a piece of furniture, but it wasn't the table that mattered. It was what it represented. A bridge she burned without looking back. A father she no longer saw as worth keeping. And in that moment, something inside me finally gave way, not anger, not hatred, just a quiet, cracking grief that settled into my bones and stayed there. She wasn't just different. She was becoming a stranger. The engagement dinner was supposed to be a celebration, one of those evenings where families blend and futures get toasted, where you look around a room and think, yeah, maybe everything's gonna be okay after all. I walked in with that mindset, even though my gut was already tight. I wore the only suit I owned, navy, a little worn at the shoulders but pressed and clean. Emily used to say I looked like a handsome grandpa in it, even long before I was grandpa age. I used to laugh and tell her she better watch her mouth. That night, she barely glanced at me long enough to notice what I was wearing. The restaurant was one of those upscale places where the menu doesn't have prices, the lighting is dim on purpose, and everyone speaks like they're afraid to disturb the furniture. Brandon and Emily were already surrounded by people when I walked in, coworkers wearing expensive watches, friends from tech startups, folks who'd never had dirt under their nails a day in their life. They greeted each other with that polished enthusiasm that always feels rehearsed. When Emily saw me, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile people give when they spot someone they didn't expect to see or didn't necessarily want to. "Dad, you made it," she said, lightly touching my arm like I was a guest, not her father. "I wouldn't miss it," I answered, meaning every word even though something in me was already shrinking. The night moved on in a polite, predictable rhythm. Brandon's father gave a speech, a long one about success, about ambition, about how proud he was to see his son create a life rooted in modern achievement. He talked like the world only had one kind of accomplishment, and it came with a corner office and a six-figure paycheck. He even chuckled about old-fashioned families, saying how glad he was that his son and Emily were building something elevated, forward-thinking. People clinked glasses, heads nodded, smiles floated across the table like shiny decoration. I felt like an antique someone had set on the wrong shelf. Still, I sat there quietly, hands folded, trying to focus on Emily's joy. The little bit of it I hoped was still real beneath all that surface polish. I kept telling myself I was reading too much into things. That she'd warm up. That maybe she just felt awkward. I didn't want to ruin her night with my hurt feelings, so I swallowed every ache, every lonely thought, and tried to be the father she needed, not the father I felt like in that moment. Then the champagne kept flowing. And that's when things turned. Emily, cheeks flushed, eyes bright in that way only alcohol makes them, stood up with her glass raised. Everyone looked at her, smiling, expecting something heartfelt or romantic. I felt a small swell of anticipation. Maybe this was the moment she'd acknowledge me, say something sweet about her upbringing, maybe a memory, maybe just a simple thank you. Something, anything. She laughed, that soft, tipsy giggle she had when she was in college. Sometimes, she said, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear, I forget how different I am from where I came from. People chuckled politely. I smiled too, even though the words stung a little. Then she added, still laughing, still bubbly, still so unaware of the dagger she was holding. Honestly, Dad feels like a stranger now. The room didn't freeze, it didn't gasp, it didn't react dramatically. Instead it laughed. Softly, lightly, casually. Like it was a harmless joke. Like her words didn't land right inside my ribcage. Like it was funny that the man who'd raised her, fed her, protected her, stayed up with her when she had nightmares, held her hand at doctor appointments, drove to every school play, had somehow become a punchline. I could have handled it if it was just the crowd laughing. But it was the way she looked at me after. She didn't wince. She didn't correct herself. She didn't say she didn't mean it. She didn't walk it back. She didn't even look sorry. She looked at me with this distant amusement, like the word stranger made perfect sense to her, like she'd said nothing wrong, like it was simply true. For a moment time slowed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to feel the floor shift beneath my feet. I tried to smile, but it felt glued to my face in the wrong place. My throat tightened. The sounds in the room blurred together, clinking glasses, soft music, polite murmurs, all of it turning into a hum that pressed against my skull. I didn't say anything. What could I say? You used to be my little girl. You used to run into my arms. You used to think I was your whole world. None of that fit the man she saw now. The stranger. I sat there, hands resting on the edge of the table, staring at the condensation sliding down my water glass. I kept thinking, how did we get here? How did I lose her without ever missing a single moment I was allowed to have? Her laughter faded, the group moved on, the conversation shifted. Someone made a joke about marriage costs. Someone else talked about flights to Europe. The night resumed its polished rhythm, completely untouched. But I wasn't untouched. Not even close. That single word, stranger, burrowed deep. It wasn't loud, but it echoed inside me in a way I couldn't silence. It repeated itself with every heartbeat. It had weight. It had sharp edges. Stranger. 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 That was the moment something dark and quiet settled inside me. That was the moment the light between us flickered and dimmed. That was the moment I realized she wasn't lost, she was gone. That was the moment the letter began forming in the back of my mind, word by word, truth by truth. A letter she never expected. A letter I never thought I'd have to write. A letter that would hold everything she needed to hear, and everything she never wanted to know. The distance between us had grown so wide that even silence felt heavy. Months passed without a call, without a text, without even one of those half-hearted holiday messages people send out of obligation. And the thing is, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger takes energy. Anger burns hot. What I felt was colder than that, a kind of quiet acceptance that maybe the girl I raised wasn't coming back. Maybe she'd already chosen a life where I didn't fit, where the man who built her world with his hands didn't belong in the one she was building now. But grief has a way of pushing you toward truth. It doesn't let you sit still. It nudges you, whispers to you, forces you to look at what's broken instead of pretending it is. And one night when the house was too quiet and the clock ticked louder than any sound should, I found myself sitting at the old scratched desk in my den. The same desk where Emily once sat doing her homework, her legs swinging because they couldn't reach the floor. I remember running a hand over the surface, feeling the dents, the grooves, the small scar where she spilled glue when she was 7. I never fixed it, didn't have the heart to. It felt like a memory stamped into the wood. I sat there for a long time before I picked up the pen. My hand shook a little, not from age but from the weight of what I was about to write. This wasn't a text message. This wasn't a conversation I could back out of. This was truth. Raw, unfiltered, untouched by Brandon's voice or society's expectations or anything she'd convinced herself about me. This letter, it was mine, and maybe the last thing she'd ever get from me. So I began. I didn't start with anger. I didn't accuse her of anything. I didn't call her ungrateful or cold or blind. I didn't mention the engagement dinner or the table she sold or the night she called me a stranger. I didn't mention the years I spent praying she'd come around. No. I started with the truth she didn't know. I told her about the first bike I ever bought her, the pink one with the tassels that she begged for. I wrote about how I worked double shifts that entire summer, sanding cabinets until my hands blistered just so I could afford it. How the day I gave it to her, she screamed with happiness and hugged me so tight my ribs ached, a kind of hug I hadn't felt in years. I told her about the slow seasons when carpentry jobs dried up, how I'd quietly skip meals so her dance lessons wouldn't get cut, how she'd run out after each recital, searching for me in the crowd, and how I'd always be there, even when her mother rolled her eyes, even when she tried to tell me my presence made Emily too emotional. I told her about the nights I sat outside her room after the divorce, listening to her cry because she didn't understand why her family was breaking apart, and how I swore I'd never be another thing she lost. I told her about the drawings she used to make, the crooked houses, the lopsided dogs, the stick figure families where she always drew me with the biggest smile. I confessed I kept every single one, boxed neatly, labeled, stored like treasure, because to me they were. I told her how her mother tried to push me out in subtle ways, how she questioned my parenting, told people I was distracting Emily, told Emily I didn't understand her, not all at once, slowly like erosion, and how I fought for every hour I got with her, every holiday, every birthday, how I drove through snowstorms and rain and long workdays because the alternative, not being there, was unthinkable. I told her about the house she grew up in, the one with the oak tree in the front yard, the one she used to climb even though I warned her she'd fall, the one she insisted was her castle. I told her I still visited it once a year, long after we moved out, just to stand in the yard and remember her laughter echoing through the windows. I told her everything, line by line, memory by memory, truth by truth. And with every sentence I wrote, a part of the ache inside me loosened. Not healed, it just loosened, like my heart finally had space to breathe again. When the letter was done, 8 handwritten pages, I sat back and stared at them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't polished like her new world demanded. But it was honest. It was mine. And it was hers too, whether she realized it or not. Then I opened the desk drawer. Inside was my will. It wasn't fancy, just a simple document prepared years ago. I unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases like I was handling something fragile. I reread it, then tucked it gently into the envelope with the letter. Not as a threat, not out of spite, not because I was sick or dying or looking for sympathy, but because she needed to see what she still meant to me, even when she didn't see me anymore. I left her the house, the land my father left me, the savings I scraped together over a lifetime of sweat and sore muscles. My workshop. My tools. Everything I built, touched, or tended to with care. All of it. And at the bottom, in my shaky handwriting, I wrote the one line I knew she needed to read more than anything else. If you call yourself a stranger to me, I won't force myself into your world. But you deserve to know what you walked away from. I sealed the envelope. My hands trembled when I pressed the flap shut. Not from weakness. From the weight of loving someone who had forgot the sound of your name in their own heart. The next morning I mailed it. Watching the envelope disappear into that blue metal box felt heavier than anything I'd ever lifted. I didn't know what she'd do with it. But I knew one thing for sure. The truth was finally hers. She called me the very same evening the letter landed in her hands, and the moment I heard her voice, I knew she had been crying long before she dialed my number. There was this tremble, this breathy struggle in her words, like someone trying to talk while their heart is still trying to steady itself. "Dad, why would you send me this?" she asked, and it wasn't the sharp tone I had grown used to, not the cool politeness she had learned to use with me over the last few years. This was different, softer, raw. Almost like the old Emily, the one who used to run to me after scraping her knee or being teased at school, the one who still believed I hung the moon for her. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't, because in her voice I heard the weight of everything she never understood, everything I had tried to protect her from, everything she had grown up believing without ever questioning. It was like the letter had pulled the curtain back on a stage she didn't know she'd been standing on her whole life. She breathed again, shaky, and said, "I'm serious, Dad. Why would you send me that? Why would you write all that stuff? Why would you put the will in there? Why now?" And her voice cracked so painfully, it sounded like something inside her was splitting apart. I finally said her name gently, carefully, like I was afraid she might shatter if I said it too loud. "Emily," I told her, "I didn't send it to hurt you." But the truth was, I think she already knew that. The letter had hit her differently, cut through the noise that had been clouding her view of me for years. Then she said something I had never expected her to admit, something that almost made me sit down even though I was already sitting. "I didn't know," she whispered, like a confession, like a truth she had been forced to face only after reading my words. "Dad, I didn't know any of this. I never knew half of what you wrote. I didn't know about the biker or the dance lessons or the house, or you never told me." And behind her voice I heard something else, a kind of trembling guilt, the realization that she had judged me without ever knowing the full picture. She continued, each word slower than the last. "Brandon said you didn't care. Mom said you moved on. Everyone made it seem like you were involved." That was the moment everything fell into place, like the scattered pieces of a puzzle snapping together in one painful, crystal-clear click. All the small moments, all the strange distance, all the questions I never asked because I didn't want to make her choose between parents. The subtle comments at holidays, the way she pulled back after visiting her mother, the sudden shifts in how she spoke to me after talking to Brandon or his family. It wasn't one blow. It was years of tiny cracks, hairline fractures, invisible but real, slowly weakening the foundation between us. She wasn't being cruel. She wasn't being heartless. She was being fed pieces of a story that didn't belong to me, pieces that painted me as someone distant, someone careless, someone who had stepped out of the role I'd never abandoned father. She believed what she heard. She believed the people closest to her. And somewhere along the way, those little distortions built walls between us. Walls I never saw being built, because I was too busy trying to respect her independence, trying not to pull her into the storms she didn't need to carry. But hurt is hurt, even when it's born from lies or misunderstandings, even when the person delivering it doesn't know they're cutting you. The sting feels the same. The ache is just as deep. And for years I had carried that ache quietly, thinking she simply didn't want me anymore, thinking she had grown up and grown away and replaced me with something shinier, newer, more modern, as Brandon liked to say. Emily cried on the phone in a way I hadn't heard since she was a kid. That soft, breathless cry that comes when the truth finally breaks through the armor someone has been wearing for years. Dad, I didn't know how hard you tried. I didn't know how much you still cared. She tried to steady her voice, but it trembled again. I didn't know you kept my drawings. I didn't know you visited the house. I thought you didn't want reminders. I almost told her the truth right then, that I had kept every single reminder I could, that her childhood home wasn't just a place to me, but a memory that lived in my bones, that I had survived some of the hardest years of my life by holding on to the idea that she still needed me in some small way. But instead, I told her the only thing that mattered in that moment. I never stopped caring, I said, not once. There was silence on her end, but it wasn't the cold silence I had learned to fear. It was the heavy silence of realization, of understanding, of a daughter re-seeing her father with new eyes. The letter had broken something, yes, but for the first time in years, it had also opened a door. A door Brandon and others had quietly helped her close. A door I had been standing on the outside of, knocking softly, hoping someday she'd let me in. She sniffed, wiped tears I couldn't see, and whispered, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And just like that, the world shifted, not back to the way it was, but to a place where healing was finally possible. Because sometimes, the deepest wounds come from misunderstanding. And sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones that finally set things right. People like to imagine revenge as something loud, explosive, full of chaos and fire. They picture slammed doors, shouting matches, bridges burning in dramatic clouds of smoke. But real life doesn't always work that way. Real life can be quieter, slower, far more devastating in its simplicity. Because sometimes revenge doesn't come from rage or retaliation. Sometimes it comes from clarity, from truth. From a single moment where the illusion cracks and someone finally sees what they've been blind to for years. And that's exactly what happened the moment Emily finished reading my letter and my will. I didn't scream. I didn't demand she come back. I didn't try to tear her life apart. All I did was tell her the truth, every hidden sacrifice, every quiet moment of love, every painful memory she had forgotten or never knew. And that truth, laid bare on paper, did more damage to the lies around her than anything else ever could. It was strange in a way. For years, Brandon had painted me as outdated, old-fashioned, a man who didn't fit into the version of life they wanted to build. Her mother had always insisted I was distant, uninterested, barely present. And Emily, torn between the people she loved and the story they kept feeding her, had chosen the version that seemed easiest to believe. The version where walking away from me made sense. The version where she didn't have to question the people whispering in her ear. My letter, a simple envelope filled with memories, sacrifices, truth that tore that version to pieces. Because when lies stack high enough, all it takes is one honest weight to collapse the whole tower. 2 days after she received it, I heard a frantic knock at my door. Not the hesitant, polite knock she'd used in recent years. The kind that sounded more like she was visiting a distant uncle than her own father, but a desperate knock. The kind that carried guilt and fear and something else, something heavier. I opened the door and saw her standing there, shoulders hunched, hair messy, makeup smeared, her breath shaky like she had run the whole way, even though she clearly drove. Her eyes were red and swollen, and before I could even say her name, she broke down completely. Not a few tears. Not a quiet sniffle. She crumbled, collapsed into me like she was trying to fold herself back into my protection, like she had finally realized how much she'd missed it. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, words spilling out so fast they tangled together. I didn't know any of it. No one told me. I didn't understand. I didn't see. Dad, please. She couldn't even breathe between sentences. Every apology came out like she was pushing it past years of guilt. She clung to me like someone who had been lost and had finally found the one thing she didn't know she'd been searching for. Her whole body shook with regret. And I just stood there, arms wrapped around her shoulders, steadying her like she was still that young girl who used to crawl into my chair after a nightmare. In that moment, I could have said 1,000 things. I could have thrown all her words back at her, the comments where she pushed me away, the dinner she skipped, the phone calls she ended early, the holidays where she sat there quiet and distant while Brandon belittled the things I valued. I could have told her how much it hurt to be called a stranger, how deeply that sentence dug into parts of me I didn't even know could still ache. I could have unleashed years of swallowed pain and unanswered questions. I could have lectured her until the sun went down. But I didn't. I just listened. She cried, she explained. She confessed the slow erosion of her understanding. How Brandon's family always made subtle comments about me not being ambitious enough. How her mother told her I had given up on having a real relationship with her. How anytime Emily doubted it, someone reminded her of a distorted version of the past. She told me about the pressure to fit into a world that didn't welcome the man who raised her. She told me how she didn't want conflict, so she convinced herself their version was true. It was easier to believe I didn't care than to confront the idea that the people around her were wrong. And as she spoke, the truth came pouring out, not just my truth, but hers. Truths she had muted, truths she had ignored, truths she had let be rewritten by the people she trusted. And watching her unravel like that, watching her unlearn things she had clung to for years, that was a kind of revenge I never intended but couldn't stop from happening. Because the truth didn't just expose their lies, it forced her to relive every moment she had dismissed me, every gesture she had brushed off, every time she chose someone else's version of me over the real one standing right in front of her. Her world didn't collapse because I attacked it. Her world collapsed because it had been built on a foundation of falsehoods. And all I did was shine a light on it. Sometimes the softest truth hits harder than any loud revenge. Sometimes honesty is sharper than any blade someone could wield. And sometimes the quiet revelation of what really happened, what really mattered, is enough to break someone more deeply than any anger ever could. The revenge wasn't the letter. The revenge wasn't the will. The revenge was the clarity. And clarity, when it finally finds its way into someone who has lived in shadows for too long, is the most devastating force in the world. Emily didn't leave Brandon in one explosive argument or some dramatic movie moment where she slammed the door and declared her independence. It wasn't the dining table. It wasn't the letter alone. It wasn't any single event that snapped her in half. No, the truth worked on her slowly, the way rain wears down stone. Every uncovered lie, every memory she revisited, every moment she realized how far she drifted from the person she used to be. It all gathered inside her until it became impossible to ignore. She told me later that she'd sat awake for 2 nights straight, just staring at the ceiling of the townhouse she once thought was her dream, realizing she didn't recognize her own life. Not the furniture, not the conversations, not the man lying beside her. She said she felt like she had been performing a version of adulthood that someone else wrote for her, following steps she never chose, repeating opinions she didn't actually believe. She told me that after she read my letter, she walked into the bathroom, sat on the floor, and cried until her ribs hurt. She cried for the boy I never met, her future son, because she imagined him growing up believing the same lies she had. She cried because she had never once asked me my side of the story. She cried because doing nothing had felt easier than standing up for the truth. And most painfully, she cried because she realized she had been calling her own father a stranger while trusting people who barely loved her at all. She didn't tell Brandon that first night, or the second. She watched him, listened to him, heard the way he spoke about my dramatic letter, how he said I was too emotional, too attached to the past, too sensitive. She watched how quickly he dismissed what didn't fit his narrative. She told me she saw him clearly for the first time, not the charming, ambitious partner she thought she admired, but a man who cared more about image than connection, about status more than truth. She realized he didn't just misunderstand me, he misunderstood her, and once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. When she finally told him she needed space, he didn't ask why. He didn't reach for her hand or try to understand. He rolled his eyes and said, "Don't let your dad manipulate you." That was the final crack. That was the moment she knew the life she'd been building with him was not built on mutual respect, but on quiet domination, the kind that rewrites your memories without you noticing, the kind that makes you doubt your own heart. Walking away wasn't easy. She told me her legs shook as she packed her things, her hands trembling with the weight of 1,000 second guesses. She said Brandon stood in the doorway, confused, annoyed, still more focused on how this would look to his parents than how it felt to lose the woman he claimed to love. She told him she needed time to rediscover who she was before she met him. He didn't fight for her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even follow her to the car. He just crossed his arms and muttered something about her being too emotional. She drove away crying, but not because of him, because for the first time in years, she felt like she was choosing herself. A week later, she came to me with a face still puffy from crying and a voice still soft from uncertainty. She sat on the porch with me, staring at her hands like she was afraid of what they had done. And then she whispered something so fragile I almost didn't hear it. "Dad, I want to know you again. Really know you. Not the version people told me you were. Not the man I convinced myself you were to make life easier. I want the truth, the real you." There was no script for what came next. No perfect apology, no instant forgiveness. Rebuilding something broken doesn't happen in a single conversation. It happens choice by choice, day by day. So we started small, almost cautiously, like trying to coax a scared bird back into your hand. Coffee on Sundays. No pressure, no heavy conversations. Just two people rediscovering the rhythm they used to have. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we sat in silence, watching people walk by, letting the comfort of presence fill the spaces that words couldn't reach. She asked me questions, real questions, not the polite, surface-level stuff she used to ask when she was trying to get through a holiday visit quickly. She wanted to know about my childhood, my regrets, the things I never told her about her mother, the dreams I gave up, the parts of my life she had never seen because she had been too young, or too shielded, or too busy believing someone else's version of me. She listened with that same earnest focus she used to have as a kid when I taught her how to tie knots on fishing lines. It felt like time folded in on itself, like the present was giving the past a second chance. She asked me if I still had the plans for the oak dining table. I told her I did, and to my surprise, she didn't just ask me to rebuild it, she asked if she could help. That single request hit me harder than any tearful apology ever could, because helping me build that table wasn't just about furniture. It was about reclaiming something we lost, something that had been stolen by distance, by manipulation, by years of silence and misunderstanding. The first day we worked on it, she showed up in old jeans and a faded sweatshirt, hair tied back the way she used to do it when she was little and too impatient to wait for me to help her with the ponytail. She walked into the workshop, hesitated for a second, then picked up the sandpaper like she'd done it 100 times. Her hands got dusty, her nose wrinkled the same way it always did when she smelled sawdust, and she laughed, a real laugh, not the polite one I'd heard in recent years. She laughed when she messed up a cut. She laughed when she dropped a plank. She laughed when I teased her about how she used to sand crooked boards when she was 9. And standing there with her beside me, cheeks flushed with effort, eyes bright with something new, or maybe something old returning, I felt something inside me thaw, something tight and bruised and protective finally loosened. Because in that moment, she wasn't the woman who had called me a stranger. She wasn't the daughter who sold my handmade table. She wasn't the person who drifted so far into someone else's world that she forgot her own roots. She was my Emily again. My girl, who used to sit on my shoulders at the county fair. My kid, who used to fall asleep in the truck with her head in my lap. My daughter, who had once held my hand, as if it were the safest place on earth. As the sunlight streamed through the workshop windows and caught the dust floating in the air, I felt something deep and steady and warm rise back into my chest, something I thought I had buried. My daughter wasn't just visiting me. She wasn't just apologizing. She wasn't just trying to fix the past. She was choosing me, choosing us, choosing the truth over the easy lie. And for the first time in years, I felt whole again.
People say family bonds shatter like glass, that once they break, the pieces can never be put back together the same way. But that's not what I've learned. Bonds don't break quick and loud, not the real ones. They bend first. They twist under pressure. They get pulled so tight you feel the strain in your bones, and then one day, when you're too tired to fight it, they snap quietly. So quietly you don't even hear it. You only notice the silence afterward. And yes, sometimes the damage feels beyond repair. Sometimes the hurt sits so deep you can't imagine reaching through it. But if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that broken doesn't always mean ruined. Not when both sides want to try. Not when truth finally enters the room. Today, life looks different. Not perfect. Not magically healed, just real. Emily calls me every morning now, sometimes before she even gets out of bed. She asks about things she never used to care about before: how to fix a loose cabinet hinge, what kind of soil tomatoes need, how to manage stress when her heart feels tight. Sometimes she calls just to hear my voice. Those calls used to feel rare, like once-in-a-blue-moon gifts. Now they're part of the rhythm of my days. I brew my coffee, sit in my old recliner, and wait for my phone to buzz with her name lighting up the screen. And every time it does, I feel something warm settle inside me. Something steady. Something that tells me I didn't lose her after all. She visits often too. Sometimes on weekends, sometimes on random Tuesday evenings with takeout in hand. She walks into the house like she used to as a kid, without hesitation, without asking permission, without shrinking herself to fit whatever version she thought she had to be. She goes through the living room, opens the fridge like it's her own, sighs at the sight of my messy workbench, and laughs like she's home. And maybe in a way she is. Not because she lives here, but because she's finally found her way back to the parts of her life that were built on truth, not someone else's version of it. She's rebuilding piece by piece, not just her relationship with me, but the relationship with her own identity. She's learning to think for herself, to question things, to choose with intention instead of habit. She tells me sometimes that she feels embarrassed for the years she drifted. She apologizes for the hurt she caused without even knowing it. And every time she does, I remind her that growth requires distance sometimes. You can't get perspective pressed up against someone else's expectations. You need space, even if that space feels like abandonment. She didn't leave me out of cruelty, and I didn't lose her out of failure. Life just happens. People get caught in currents stronger than they realize. As for the letter, the one that started everything, she keeps it in the drawer beside her bed. Not folded away like a memory she wants to forget. Not locked up like a shame she's running from. She keeps it there as a reminder. A reminder of how close she came to losing something irreplaceable. A reminder of the moment she finally saw her life clearly. A reminder of the truth she spent years avoiding. She told me once that reading that letter felt like standing in front of a mirror for the first time in a long time and recognizing the person staring back. Not Brandon's version of her. Not her mother's version. Hers. And I think that's the part that changed everything. Not my hurt, not my sadness, not even my disappointment, but the truth. The truth sat between us for years, waiting for the moment it could stand louder than the lies that had twisted themselves into her understanding. I didn't send the letter to punish her. I didn't send it to guilt her or pull her back into my life. I sent it because silence had become its own kind of poison. And sometimes the only antidote is honesty, even when it hurts like hell. My story isn't about anger, though trust me, I felt it. It isn't about punishment, even if part of me wanted to give the world a taste of the pain it handed me. It isn't even about revenge, not the loud, vengeful kind people imagine when they hear stories like mine. No, what I learned is that truth itself can be revenge. Not because it destroys, but because it reveals. Truth exposes lies. Truth unmasks manipulation. Truth forces people to see what they've been avoiding. And sometimes, truth cuts deeper than any blade words could offer. Sending that letter was the hardest thing I've ever done, and the best. It didn't just wake Emily up. It woke me up too. It reminded me that being silent doesn't make you noble. It makes you invisible, and fathers shouldn't have to disappear to keep the peace. So if you're listening to my story, if any part of it feels familiar, whether you're the parent or the child or someone caught in the middle, take this with you. Never let the world convince you that love is outdated. Love doesn't go out of style just because people get busy or distracted or influenced by louder voices. Real love stays, even when it's bruised, even when it's quiet, even when it's misunderstood. And never, never let distance rewrite the truth between you and the people who matter. Distance can make things blurry, but it doesn't change what's real unless you let it. At the end of the day, relationships aren't destroyed by miles. They're destroyed by assumptions, by silence, by letting other people narrate your story for you. If you love someone, tell them. If you're hurt, say it. If the truth is heavy, share it before it crushes you. Because in the end, truth isn't just revenge. Truth is the bridge that brings people home.